Hi there, and thanks for joining in today. Welcome on board. It's Q1E8, and we are looking at the topic free will, love, and divine providence. Allow me to begin today with a story about Kelechi Amaji. I need you to remember that name. It was the 11th of July, 19 days to my birthday, in 2011, exactly 64 days after her wedding. Location: a seismic exploration site in the northern part of Nigeria between Maiduguri and Lake Chad. My eyes were glued to the screen as my fingers flew across the keyboard. My boss pacing anxiously behind me. The room was tense, filled with the pressure of deadlines and pending deliverables as we worked on the execution of the 3D seismic data acquisition program for JV109, designed by Oga Omoru, the J himself. It was the first vibrosex operation in the country for the National Oil and Gas Company. Flanked by the ever serious looking Ifogale on my left and the meticulous processing queen Nafisa on my right, with Tim and Oga Moses supervising the short point field line checkers. It was all hands on deck. But my mind was not there. It was miles away with my best friend Kay. You see, Kelechi was not just my best friend, she was my anchor. Younger than me, full of life, her laughter had this way of lighting up even the darkest days. She kept me grounded, covered in praise, always held my back. Just a couple of months into her marriage, she needed surgery. As always, we prayed. The night before, she asked me for one simple thing. Day Day, please call me before the wheel may in tomorrow. I need to talk to you. I promised, and I meant it. The next day, my alarm buzzed, a reminder of the promise I made to call. But I was stuck. My screen was flashing, my boss was pacing, the entire project was hanging by a thread. So I whispered a prayer in my heart, hoping it will be enough. A few hours later, my phone rang. Guess what? It was her husband. The news? She didn't make it. Everything suddenly went black. I passed out. Now, days later, when I finally gathered the strength to speak to her father, I braced myself for details. What he told me shattered me even more. Surgery had been successful, but the medical team failed to make provision for enough blood for transfusion post surgery. And she just bled out, just like that. It just broke me. I could not process that, still cannot today. She did not have to die. This was not fate. This had nothing to do with a divine decree. This was a failure, period. A reckless, preventable failure. Now, this is where it gets interesting. A well meaning friend, in an attempt to console me, said the usual six-worded phrase we often hear in the face of tragedy: take heart. It was God's will. God's will? Really? The moment he said it, everything else he said faded into static. If this was God's will, then what kind of God was he? A God who orchestrates senseless negligence? A God who allows young life to be cut short by incompetence? The questions just came rushing in, overwhelmingly, relentlessly. Did God take her from me? Was he the one? Is it always God's will when bad things happen? Does God micromanage every detail of life, or are there some other variables at play here? Are there principles that govern how He interacts with humanity? What what role does free will play in all of this? These are not just philosophical musings. These are life-altering questions that shake the foundations of faith. 7 questions, 7 big, unsettling questions. Let's start with the most important truth. God is all powerful. On that, my friend was right. Jesus said, "What is impossible with man is possible with God." The intricate design of creation reveals God's magnificence. It is neither too hard nor too late for Him to fix anything if He so wills. But here's the real question. Does being all powerful mean that everything that happens is exactly how He wants and what He wants? Or are there other forces at play here? It is easy to assume that because God is all powerful, that He should just simply override everything, as in wipe out evil, stop every tragedy, prevent every disaster. After all, He can. Now, while that is true, here's the thing. God does not just wield power, He governs it. The Bible gives us a glimpse into how God regulates His omnipotence by His principles. For instance, 2 Timothy 2 verse 13 reads, "If we are faithless, God remains faithful, for He cannot deny Himself." Psalms 138 verse 2 reads, "For you, O God, have exalted your word above your name." The list goes on. The point here is this. 1. Power without principle is tyranny, and God is not a tyrant. Though absolutely omnipotent, in keeping with His character of being entirely good and the one who neither compels nor forces worship and allegiance, God has confined Himself to His principles, meaning, though omnipotent, God will not venture into grounds that contradict His character. If you recall, in Q1E8, we dissected how sin and evil entered our world. Now, one crucial takeaway, if you recall, was that there are other forces in play. Top on that list are free will, the divine gift that allows us to freely choose without interference. Number 2 is Satan and his cohorts. The Bible calls him the accuser of the brethren, so find in Revelation 12 verse 10. Now let's focus on the free will for a moment. True free will can only exist if there are no interferences. For this to happen, God in His omnipotence has to choose to honor it, meaning He will never force obedience, never compel loyalty, never accept forced worship. Yeah, He may, nudge one, woo in a variety of ways, but He will not force obedience or compliance. We see this hypothesis play out in the most heart-wrenching way in the life and ministry of Jesus. Now, on one occasion, in His triumphant entry into Jerusalem, it should have been a joyous moment. The crowd cheered, palm branches lined the streets, voices cried out, "Hosanna!" But then something happened that no one expected. Jesus just broke down in tears. The Creator, the one through whom all things were made, was weeping. But why? Well, because in his foreknowledge, he saw what was coming. He knew the disaster that awaited Jerusalem. He saw the avoidable destruction looming over them. He so desperately wanted to save them, but they wouldn't let him. And boy, he tried. He sent them prophets, he pleaded with them, he even came down himself. And yet, they resisted. They sabotaged every effort he made to save them. And that broke his heart. Because here's the truth. He could not interfere against their will. He would not force himself upon them. He would only save those who allowed him to save. His preference was to redeem them, but their choices was to reject him. And that is the risk of free will. Let's get this straight. God is not the mastermind behind every event that unfolds in our world. And why? Well, because it's not up to God what humans choose. For free will to be genuine, it must be honored by both the giver and the receiver. And that includes God himself. That means that one, people would not always choose right. And God would not force them to. So if free will is truly at play, then everything we see, the good, the bad, and the unspeakable evil, is not a reflection of God's will, but of human choices. Now, that raises another question. If our choices shape our destiny, how then do we reconcile that with predestination? Now, some interpret Ephesians 1, verse 9 to 11 as evidence that God has already pre-selected who will be saved and who will be lost, regardless of their choices. In other words, our fate is sealed even before we have a say in it. Sounds unfair? Well, that's because it is. This interpretation is eerily similar to the once saved, always saved doctrine, and it raises some serious questions. If predestination means our eternity is fixed, then what's the point of free will? Why bother making good choices if they do not matter? Now, imagine a legal system where a person is pre-sentenced to life in prison before even committing a crime. Another is pre-cleared, no matter how much harm they cause. That wouldn't be justice. That'll be chaos. And since God is just, there must be another way to understand this verse, one that aligns with his character better. But before we get there, let's apply an important principle. 1. You do not build a doctrine from a single verse. The entire Bible must support the interpretation. If it doesn't, then the interpretation is wrong, period. So what does the rest of the scripture actually say on this topic? The Bible paints a very different picture. For instance, in Luke 7 verse 30, it reads, "But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's purpose for themselves, not having been baptized by John." God had a blueprint, but they rejected it. In Psalms 81 from verse 11 to 14, "But my people did not listen to my voice, and Israel did not obey me. So I gave them over to the stubbornness of their hearts, to walk in their own devices. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would quickly subdue their enemies and turn my hand against the adversaries. God wanted better for them, but they refused. Ponis, in all of this, God had a preference for them, but in exercising their free will, they chose not to align with God and His blueprints. And there were consequences. Their disobedience deprived them access to certain privileges of His presence, meaning how we exercise our free will in conforming or disconforming to God's preferences does influence what we receive from God. By making valid the role of exercising free will in influencing what we receive from God, these texts debunk the premise of this version of predestination. There must therefore be another interpretation in congruence with the principles here established, one that makes sense of both God's sovereignty and human free will. Hold that thought, we'll get back to it. Moving on, there is a principle at play here, one that reshapes how we understand God's role in our lives. It is the concept of God's perfect and permissive will. God's perfect will is His blueprint, the ideal scenario, how He would prefer things to play out if everyone fully cooperated with Him. God's perfect will is what happens when people do not cooperate, a reality that factors in human choices, even when they deviate from the original plan of God. Why? Well, because free will exists and God honors it, even when it leads to outcomes He never intended. For instance, when God promised Abraham a son, His perfect will was clear: Isaac through Sarah. But when waiting felt unbearable, Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hands. Enter Ishmael, the result of human impatience. Did God approve of this detour? Absolutely not. Did He abandon Abraham? Again, no. Like a GPS recalculating a route, God worked with their deviation and still led them back to His promise. Lesson: God's sovereignty does not mean He forces outcomes. It means He can work through any outcome, even our wrong turns, if we stick with Him. So what does predestination really mean? It is not God pre-selecting who makes it or who doesn't. Rather, it means God has a plan that accounts for every free decision that we make if we stick with Him. Ephesians 1 verse 9 to 11 does not suggest a rigid fate, but rather a future shaped by God's knowledge of our choices. If we all cooperate fully, it will be paradise on earth. But it's not all up to God. We still have to choose. And choices have consequences. So let's settle this once and for all. Is it always God's will when bad things happen? Absolutely not. Some things are caused by God, no doubt. Others happen because of free human choices, sometimes influenced by Satan himself. Many things unfold in this world that God never wanted to happen. We see this in Jesus' reaction to suffering during His ministry. The Bible records that He healed the sick. He wept over human pain. He grieved over our brokenness. If suffering were always His will, He would not have spent His time and life fighting against it. The fact That we endure pain does not mean that God planned it for us. But here's the hope. While God does not cause all the suffering, He can still bring something good out of it if we stick with Him and stay the course. On a lighter note, when next you have to console someone navigating through the anomalies of life, please do not be like my friend. Choose your words carefully. It is not always God's will when bad things happen. And that brings us to the end of this week, folks. Next week, we will dive into the topic free will and divine providence. You do not want to miss this one. Until then, stay the course. I remain your Tabasco Doodle, doodling out. Let's make it make sense. If you were blessed by this session today, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you are notified as soon as we publish next time. And if you haven't given your life to Christ, you should while you still can. I'll see you next week, God willing. Happy Sabbath.